During World War I, in the year 1917, Carl Jung writes the following words, quote, "This war has pitilessly revealed to civilized man that he is still a barbarian, but the psychology of the individual corresponds to the psychology of the nation. What the nation does is done also by each individual, and so long as the individual does it, the nation also does it. Only the change in the attitude of the individual is the beginning of the change in the psychology of the nation." End quote. It is really impossible for us today to comprehend the psychological effect of the world wars on Western civilization. Carl Jung lived through that period. He was born in the 19th century, and he lived through World War I, the interwar years, World War II, and the Cold War. The period from the French Revolution up to the point of the outbreak of World War I is sometimes called the long 19th century. This was a term coined by a Russian historian that has been adopted into widespread usage. And the argument for that term is simply this, that the zeitgeist of what we call the 19th century is not bound within a neat 100-year period, that rather there is a certain mindset, a certain worldview, and we might say a certain set of challenges and questions that defines the era. And the argument would be that the 19th century is born with the French Revolution. That's where that mindset comes into being, with that attempt to establish universal citizenship and egalitarian society in France, to establish a republic. Obviously, it didn't quite work out that way. I mean, there were fits and starts, but that was the beginning of that great idea. And social movements that are very familiar to us, such as anarchism, socialism, democracy itself, these come into vogue in the 19th century. Nationalism, in fact, the modern concept of a nation, that comes into being at this time, as does the progressive movement in America. It's an age where people begin to perceive that we are bound together as a group, as a common force, either by virtue of being countrymen, that would be the nationalistic version of collective identity, or perhaps we're bound together by a class, by virtue of being proletarians, that would be the socialistic creation of a group identity. And above all, the 19th century is this time in which we explore the possibilities of what humanity can collectively accomplish. It's an age of experimentation in all domains. And in spite of the violence and social upheaval that comes with these experiments, there's also a sense of technological and scientific progress. And if not seen as an inevitability, it's at least a proven engine of cumulative human effort and will that yielded up amazing results. I mean, for example, the steam engine transforms European and American life. Inventors and scientists, figures such as Tesla and Steinmetz, furnish us with the modern electrical grid. The grandeur of the Chicago World's Fair takes place during this era in the year 1893. 40 nations participate in that fair. An entire city is constructed for the event, replicating neoclassical architecture. There's this vast expanse of edifices. I mean, the first Ferris wheel is created there, only to burn it all down at the end of the fair, for the most part. And so there's just this sense of mounting power being gathered into human hands through growing scientific knowledge and the hard work and ingenuity of humanity. And I wouldn't call the long 19th century optimistic, not in the same way that the 18th century is often said to be. The mood of the era is a bit different. We could say the mood is one which throws itself headlong into experiment and change. That's the age also of writers such as Nietzsche, Emerson, Wilde. The eyes of the era are turned to the future, and not out of a naive belief that things will always get better, but rather eager to confront the challenge of what is to come in the future. That mood, that mindset, that to me is what defines the long 19th century, and all of that dies a horrific death at the Battle of the Marne at the start of World War I. If you're a longtime fan of the podcast, you probably know that a huge influence of mine is Dan Carlin, and I'm going to shamelessly steal a story that I heard from Carlin on his podcast, but one that I think is very illustrative concerning the way I want to ground our approach to the essay we're going to talk about today. And the story's about Ernest Shackleton, the explorer who tried and failed to reach the South Pole in a series of expeditions, one of which takes place during the Great War, as they called it in those days. And famously, when Shackleton returned, after another failed expedition in 1916, he asked when the war had ended, assuming that the Great War, like all of the other recent wars on the European continent, would last a year or two, sometimes even less than that, and then conclude with some new treaty negotiation, some cessation of territory, and then things go back to normal. But to his shock and horror, Shackleton learns that this is not the case. He asks, quote, "Tell me, when was the war over?" End quote. And he's told, quote, "The war is not over. Millions are being killed. Europe is mad. The world is mad." End quote. And I wanted to bring that story into it because that was quite literally the feeling that gripped all of Europe at the horrifying reality of the First World War. The world has gone mad. The First World War is experienced as a kind of sudden onset of mass insanity. I mean, we could say, all war could be described that way, but they called the First World War the war to end all wars with good reason. I mean, one of the things that Carlin talks about in his episodes on World War I is the way in which these French officers, still dressed in sort of the regalia from an earlier time, would stand up and unsheathe their swords and try to lead a valiant charge toward the other side, only to just be ripped apart by artillery. That you just had parts of France being turned into the surface of the moon, and widespread disease and starvation, and millions dead, and a frozen conflict that grinds on, senselessly, meaninglessly, as lives are thrown away en masse to fight for meters worth of land, only to lose those meters a month later. And so all of the industrial and scientific power that had enriched humanity, that had once seemed to promise a wealthier, more prosperous future, instead it now shows a level of destruction, shows that it's capable of a level of destruction no one had ever experienced before, and seemingly to no good reason. And it's largely because of the technological advancements that are brought to bear during the Great War that the frozen nature of the conflict is created, that it seems to go nowhere, which, what is that old cliche that we're all tired of hearing? That the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting the same result. I mean, how would you define trench warfare? That's exactly what it's like. And so we find in World War I that we can collectively accomplish not just great things, but we can collectively accomplish unprecedented barbaric slaughter that would have made the most brutal Bronze Age kings blush. That for all our scientific progress, how little man himself has changed. And it seems that in spite of our attempts to arrange society according to correct principles and create social structures that align with those principles, to create rational systems for improving human life and so on, none of that will matter if, psychologically, we remain unchanged from the naked apes that first invented the bow and the club. If we are still driven by unconscious impulses, if we're still motivated by those same dark animalian drives that created empires and god kings in the past, then why wouldn't we continue to replicate those same behaviors, merely in a heightened, more destructive manner when handed superior power and knowledge? In the first section of Carl Jung's essay, The Undiscovered Self, he writes about this, of how our experiments with the aim of producing a more rational or egalitarian type of government, which we could say begin in the long 19th century and continue up until the present day, these attempts always become subverted because these abstractions by which we thought we were improving our human attempts at governance merely mask a psychological reality which remains ever human all too human. Jung writes, quote, "The individual becomes more and more a function of society, which in turn usurps the function of the real life carrier, whereas in fact, society is nothing more than an abstract idea like the state. Both are hypostatized, that is, have become autonomous. The state in particular is turned into a quasi-animate personality from whom everything is expected. In reality, it is only a camouflage for those individuals who know how to manipulate it. Thus, the constitutional state drifts into the situation of a primitive form of society, the communism of a primitive tribe, where everybody is subject to the autocratic rule of a chief or an oligarchy." End quote. Carl Jung was one of the formative figures of psychoanalysis. He devoted a great deal of his career to understanding pathologies, trying to understand the root causes of insanity, in other words. Because of this, he treated the notion that the world wars were cases of mass insanity very seriously. If the entire world can go mad, what does that mean for humanity, for the future of humanity? And perhaps the way that we framed the social and political challenges facing mankind as a question of retooling systems or developing new social technologies, adopting a more rational framework for society, perhaps all of that would need to be entirely rethought if that were the case. In Nietzsche's coinage, quote, "In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule," end quote. Nietzsche was very influential on Jung, providing him with the notions of the unconscious, of pre-rational impulses as the beginning of human thought. But Jung wanted to actually identify what it was that created these spasms of mass insanity. What are the causes? What are the conditions? It's not enough to simply accept mass insanity as a rule of human life. There are definite times of relative peace and stability and definite times of utter chaos, just as there are mentally healthy individuals and psychotic individuals. We ought to know how to distinguish one from the other, right? And so that is Jung's project, but Nietzsche's sentiment is interesting, at least insofar as he suggests that insanity is the baseline. That civilization from that perspective would be the exceptional case. And I should note briefly as well, the insanity is not over after the Great War. After a brief interim, the world once again goes mad. With the outbreak of World War II, we see that collectivist tendency to form group identities based around things such as nationality or political ideology, or subservience to an abstraction such as the state, or an abstraction such as the race. These tendencies coalesce into Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. So it's not just the senseless, sustained violence that shocks the world as it did during the First Great War, but now the rise of cult-like tyrannies that are willing to use industrial-scale violence to construct a desired social system. And so, after the Allies win the war, what follows that is the Cold War. And once again, we have two political blocs staring one another down in this uncompromising state of mutual hostility, and now with technology that is unthinkably more destructive than anything used on the battlefield back in World War I. It almost seems quaint compared to the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb. And it seems that the only thing that we can trust to keep us from using these weapons is the continued sanity of all parties involved. And yet, the two world wars would seem to show that that is the one thing that's not guaranteed. Because if it had only happened once, you could maybe regard it as an aberration. The fact that it happens a second time and is even worse the second time would certainly call into question many of the assumptions that we might have had about the ordinary state of the human being as rational, sober, and sane. And so, as such, in the thick of the Cold War in 1956, Jung penned this brief essay, originally titled in German, Present and Future. In English, this essay is known as the Undiscovered Self, which is how we will refer to it here. Jung begins by suggesting that, quote, "Today, as the end of the second millennium draws near, we are again living in an age filled with apocalyptic images of universal destruction." End quote. Jung is, of course, interested in symbolism and the psychological implications of symbolism, looking into sort of what does the cultural zeitgeist tell us, and at previous times in which mankind has felt as if we're at a great inflection point, a great state of transition. There have been, in the religious zeitgeist, visions of these apocalyptic images. And, the striking thing is that by the time of the 1950s, these images are not even limited to religious visions. They can be seen by everyone, not only in the documentation on film and photograph of what had already happened, the apocalyptic levels of destruction in Europe, but portrayals in cinema of the possibilities for what could happen. And so Jung's concern is the present state of human civilization and its future trajectory, hence present and future. But the pressing question is this. It seems as though sanity, order, stability are not in fact guaranteed. They're in fact incredibly fragile. And that there is, in Jung's view, the thinnest veneer of sanity that is maintained by society, far more delicate than we like to believe. Jung writes, quote, "Everywhere in the West there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the incendiary torches ready, with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas, except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. One should not overestimate the thickness of this stratum. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. Also, it is regionally dependent on public education and is subject to the influence of acutely disturbing factors of a political and economic nature. Taking plebiscites as a criterion, one could, on an optimistic estimate, put its upper limit at about 40% of the electorate. A rather more pessimistic view would not be unjustified either, since the gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding peculiarities, and even where it exists, it proves to be wavering and inconstant, the more so, as a rule, the bigger the political groups are. The mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual, and this necessarily leads to doctrinaire and authoritarian tyranny if ever the constitutional state should succumb to a fit of weakness." End quote. So Jung estimates that around 40% of society is the stratum of what he calls, quote, "fairly intelligent and mentally stable," end quote. So not a majority, but a strong plurality. Although he says it varies from country to country, it's subject to fluctuate, and it actually might be far fewer than 40%. Why would the number of sane individuals change at all, though? Why would it be subject to fluctuation? Well, he mentions differences in education and culture, different economic and political factors. But even then, his point might be a bit mysterious, because why would, for example, economic factors change your level of sanity? Well, so Jung says there's no statistic available on merely latent psychopathy. He says, for obvious reasons. So because if it's latent psychopathy, then there wouldn't be symptoms of it, and if it's not symptomatic, then you wouldn't know it's there. So we're inevitably dealing in the realm of speculation here. But Jung's perspective is that the more the emotionality of the group heightens, the less the individual's reason is able to apply itself to rational argument. Perhaps an easy mnemonic for thinking about this is that reason, insofar as Jung writes about it and talks about it, particularly in this essay, is the operation and the work of an individual mind. It might be multiple individual minds in concert, but nevertheless, reason functions on an individual level. It has to be evaluated, accepted, rejected, so on and so forth by the individual. Whereas emotion, the way that Jung talks about it here, is mimetic. In other words, that emotion is not limited to the individual. Emotions can be transmitted throughout, say, a crowd. The emotional state, the mood of a crowd will affect the mood of the individuals within that crowd, regardless of what emotional state they bring in with them when they join that crowd. If the crowd is angry and riled up, it's going to have that effect on individuals within it who might not even feel that way, but the emotion will be mimetically transmitted to them. That is the way Jung tends to speak about emotion here. So the more that the emotionality of a group heightens, or the emotional level, the emotional pitch across all of society heightens, which is very difficult. I mean, we're again necessarily sort of speculating and abstracting here, but you could see it just as a logical consequence, right? That the heightened emotionality, the higher the pitch of emotion, the less the individual is able to weigh pros and cons in a cool-headed manner, the less they're going to be open to hearing opposing views, moderating their positions, and so on and so forth. And so to go back to those political and economic factors, so suppose that all of a sudden you don't have enough money to purchase both enough food for your household and medicine that you need for your child. If that situation is sustained, you're in that situation every week, every month, for a whole year, you'll enter into what is called a scarcity mindset. And even if you don't know anything about this concept, just take a guess. Do you think this mindset would make you more emotional or less emotional? Would it make you more clear-headed or less clear-headed? The answer, of course, is that it's going to make you more emotional and less clear-headed. And so then we might imagine that if an entire nation is in a scarcity mindset, the entire populace is going to become, on the balance, less rational. And that is the kind of social condition in which revolutions tend to happen, by the way. For all the talk of revolution or political unrest that we hear in the West, revolutions simply do not usually happen if everyone is able to feed themselves and the lights are on and the water's running. But if you take away even just one of those factors, right, you've created a situation where revolution becomes much more likely. And so too with factors like hyperinflation or mass starvation and so on and so forth. And so further down in the same section, the first section, Jung says, quote, "For every manifest case of insanity, there are, in my estimation, at least 10 latent cases who seldom get to the point of breaking out openly, but whose views and behavior, for all their appearance of normality, are influenced unconsciously by pathological and perverse factors." End quote. So, in other words, beneath this stratum of sanity, there's a constant threat of the latent insanity below bubbling up to the surface. And the way he discusses insanity here, he uses a lot of language also as the language of infection. He writes of the vectors by which madness can be transmitted. You might have caught it in the earlier passage we read. Jung actually uses the term "stop the spread." We possess very little means of stopping the spread of these infectious ideas. And so Jung uses this sort of language, and one of his concerns, consequently, is how do we come to an understanding of the nature of the immune system that this large plurality of people possess that allows them to remain relatively intelligent, reasonable, and sane, and through a kind of herd immunity, keep mass insanity from breaking forth. That is how Jung is thinking about this. And, I've been speaking a lot again on the sort of speculative abstract level, but we could set aside broader social factors and think about this as a simple practical matter of not, the crowd or the mass as the totality of society, but think of a physical crowd that has gathered. That crowd takes on a life of its own, and the voice of the individual can't be heard. Sometimes, practically speaking, in a large enough crowd, you literally cannot be heard. Try having a conversation in the midst of a loud, boisterous crowd. And, a really easy go-to example would be like the angry mob, trying to reason with the angry mob. But we don't even have to use such a vulgar example. It doesn't have to be an aggressive crowd. An energetic crowd at a rock concert. What would happen if you were to send somebody out to give a lecture on epistemology to that group? They're going to boo that person, right? I don't even have to use an extreme example as that. I'll use an example from my own life. I once saw the comedian Brian Posehn open for Slayer. And he's a great comedian, and I enjoyed his set, but people were booing him throughout the entire thing. And, because they're in a heightened emotional state. They're in a state of tension. They're waiting for a violent release of energy that's going to come at the beginning of the concert when the first note and the rhythm kicks in. They're excited to have a certain sensory experience. They're all there for that purpose. And then you have this guy come out and do monotone comedy before that. And it's just a complete clash. And whereas in another venue, many of the people might have very much appreciated that comedy there, it was actually very uncomfortable because they were very angry about, the mismatch of the emotional state they were in with the nature of the presentation, the performance that was being given at the moment, which did not match at all what they were there to experience. Another example might be a crowd at a political rally. They don't want to hear criticism of their chosen candidate. They want to hear beautiful words said about their candidate. They're gathered there to cheer. The individuals in the crowd might be able to think critically as individuals about the policy platform of the candidate, and probably all have their disagreements on some level with what their own candidate is doing. But as a crowd, as a unit, they can't have those disagreements. And so when the power of the crowd begins to get going, Jung writes, quote, "Under these conditions, all those elements whose existence is merely tolerated as asocial under the rule of reason come to the top." End quote. So when Jung says the rule of reason, he's specifically talking about constitutional government, in contrast to the personality cults, rule by force, that are definitive of communism and fascism. So when the rule of reason is in place, constitutional government, what keeps such a thing in check is that veneer of sane individuals. But at every moment, dark pathological impulses that are within us, all of us, could ripple through the crowd, mimetically, even ripple through the entirety of a culture, drive it into a barbaric state of mind, and one that's scarcely even believed possible in the mind of the ordinary person. And, that might be a shocking claim to make, but Jung would say, this has already happened. We have seen this happen 2 times, right? So we can sort of dispense with our disbelief that this is the case, as far as Jung is concerned. And that's what he means when he speaks of the subversive minorities, ready to set the flame at any moment. There are people at either fringe, the extreme of the left wing and the right wing, the extreme authoritarians and extreme anarchists, whatever flavor they might be. These people who are anxiously waiting for the breakdown of the existing order. And while there may not be enough of them to take on the whole population, what's interesting about revolutions is that it's usually a small vanguard. It's usually a fraction of the populace that's on board with the revolution, that are the true believers, so to speak. It's just a tiny percentage of the Russian population who were Bolsheviks on the eve of the revolution. And so Jung's hypothesis is an attempt to explain how that could be. That basically, those who wish to disrupt society are actually a very small number of people. So how could it be that they could actually pose a threat? Well, they don't operate by rationally convincing the ordinary people to go along with them. In some way, operating by means of reason will always operate on that one-to-one, individual-to-individual basis, right? In the form of the dialectic, of one individual dialoguing with another, trying to bring them around to a more reasonable point of view. That's a very slow way for your sort of inoculation to work, if you think reason is the inoculation against this madness, right? Whereas these sort of mad emotionality of the crowd, it's more of an infection or something that, again, ripples or flows through the society in the form of a wave that bypasses the human reason. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go on. So this is a small number of people who don't operate by rationally convincing the ordinary people to go along with them, and yet they sometimes succeed. They take advantage of a heightened emotional situation in which desperate and distraught people will be susceptible to any movement that allows their latent asocial tendencies to, come out and play, so to speak, particularly their capacities for violence and aggression and so on, or avarice, or whatever the case may be. I mean, there's an interesting passage from Nietzsche where he says that every time we find ourselves in a position of seeking liberation or emancipation, it's usually because there's some drive within us, so some impulse or passion that is really seeking liberation in order to impose its own ends. That, in other words, to speak more aphoristically, behind all libertarianism, there's always the danger that what's actually driving it is libertinism. Now, I made reference earlier to the immune system, the psychological immune system, as we might call it, our immune system against psychological illness. And Jung ventures an assertion as to what the nature of this immune system is. He says it is self-knowledge. But immediately we have a problem here, because the conception that most of us have of what self-knowledge even is impoverished, because it's still rooted in the prejudice that the self is primarily the ego consciousness. Intimate knowledge of one's outward persona, Their conscious persona might be useful for any number of things, but such a knowledge fails to take into account the majority of what one is, which is to say, unconscious impulse. And just as all of us live in a body, yet only see the surface and skin of our physical form, and we're not experts in the inner workings of our own body, right? One needs a physician for that. Similarly, with the psyche, most of us only see the surface, and we're not experts in the inner workings, most of which is hidden beneath the skin of the ego consciousness. Most of us, in fact, possess a very limited self-knowledge. And furthermore, most of what we consider to be knowledge is scientific knowledge. And because of that, self-knowledge tends to elude us, because it necessarily cannot be accounted for by scientific thinking. If we were to have a scientific understanding of the psychological reality of mankind, it would necessarily have to concern itself with all mankind, because science deals in the realm of general knowledge, universal knowledge. The laws of physics don't apply only in certain times and places, but everywhere. Water boils at a certain temperature. And you might say, well, the boiling point changes according to factors like altitude, right? But even that factor, that's a constant that can be accounted for, right? So even all of the exceptions to the rules are really just the intersection of two rules producing an outcome, right? And so there's this huge thread running through the Undiscovered Self of Jung's challenge to this understanding of human beings, which is based on statistics. That the statistical understanding of mankind is based on a necessarily abstract idea of the ideal average. It's abstract because the average need not even exist. But unfortunately, this is oftentimes the content of scientific knowledge, is knowledge as it pertains to that ideal average. And this is not to say that this is false or useless in any way. That's not what Jung is saying. But Jung makes a very important point that I think explains this by means of example. Quote, if, for instance, I determine the weight of each stone in a bed of pebbles and get an average weight of 5 ounces, this tells me very little about the real nature of the pebbles. Anyone who thought, on the basis of these findings, that he could pick up a pebble of 5 ounces at the first try would be in for a serious disappointment. Indeed, it might well happen that however long he searched, he would not find a single pebble weighing exactly 5 ounces. The statistical method shows the facts in light of the ideal average, but does not give us a picture of their empirical reality. While reflecting an indisputable aspect of reality, it can falsify the truth in a most misleading way. The distinctive thing about real facts, however, is their individuality. Not to put too fine a point on it, but one could say that the real picture consists of nothing but exceptions to the rule, and that in consequence, absolute reality has predominantly the character of irregularity. End quote. And so, we cannot provide the masses with a statistical theory about self-knowledge that would be of any use to them for this very reason. He gives the devil his due. He says that statistical facts reflect an indisputable aspect of reality. There are statistical realities that have to be acknowledged. And, an astute reader should notice, Jung made a statistical speculation at the beginning of the essay with his remark that 40% of us or so are sane, right? But it's simply the case that the rule never perfectly reflects the irregular individuality of each empirical case, which means that in some strange way, irregularity is the rule. And so there's a real danger that emerges as a result of a totalizing statistical worldview, which that's one of Jung's main targets in this essay. The loss of self-knowledge is what occurs under that worldview, because that's something that cannot be attained via the method of scientific knowledge, because it is always individual and irregular. Self-knowledge in this scientific worldview is allowed to languish, because the nature of the knowledge we seek is the knowledge of the statistical ideal. In a later section, this is in section 4, Jung helps elucidate this point when he makes some remarks about the difference between an abstract and scientifically oriented psychology and medical psychology. This is the psychology of the academic, which takes the form of general rules, versus that of the clinician, that has to be put into practice on the individual level. And I'm going to read here in an abridged form, quote, "A scientifically oriented psychology is bound to proceed abstractly. That is, it removes itself just sufficiently far from its object not to lose sight of it altogether. That is why findings of laboratory psychology are, for all practical purposes, often so remarkably unenlightening and devoid of interest. The more the individual object dominates the field of vision, the more practical, detailed, and alive will be the knowledge derived from it. Academic psychology prefers to avoid complex situations by asking ever simpler questions, which it can do with impunity. It has full freedom in the choice of questions it will put to nature. Medical psychology, on the other hand, is very far from being in this more or less enviable position. Here, the object puts the question, and not the experimenter. The analyst is confronted with facts that are not of his choosing, and which he probably never would choose if he were a free agent. It is the sickness of the patient himself that puts the crucial questions. In other words, nature experiments with the doctor, and expecting an answer from him. The uniqueness of the individual and of his situation stares the analyst in the face and demands an answer." End quote. So I think this very well characterizes Jung's approach. He's not anti-scientific. He's very much in favor of empiricism. It's just that when you have experience as a clinician, as an empiricist, you will observe that each individual case defies the rule. And wherever we attempt to do psychology based around those statistical realities, do psychology within a controlled environment, where we can then ask nature a question about one given factor, when in fact, factors, quote unquote, environmental, social, or what have you, never appear in isolate. They are always this concatenation of factors in an individual life, right? And so you never actually come to an understanding of the irregularity of the patient that way. You come to these general conclusions, these statistical conclusions, that, in fact, as Jung points out with the example with the pebbles, might never actually apply in real life. And so, in the medical field, I love the way he puts this. Nature puts the questions to you, you don't put the questions to nature. In the medical field, you don't contrive the situation and then test and repeat it with total control over the environment, trying to ask the simplest possible question, right? Instead, you're faced with a human being, often with pathologies that you would never choose to study, and raising questions you would never choose to pursue as a result of, it's the specific questions that the patient's situation demands that you answer, right? Nature is putting the demand on you. And so that reversal, I think, is very important for understanding Jung's point of view and his criticism of scientism, or whatever we want to call it here. We could say it's Jung's problem with a scientific positivist worldview, or we might say more precisely, the statistical worldview. And he sums it up very well here. This is going back to section 1, quote, "Under the influence of scientific assumptions, not only the psyche but the individual man, and indeed all individual events whatsoever, suffer a leveling down and a process of blurring that distorts the picture of reality into a conceptual average. We ought not to underestimate the psychological effect of the statistical world picture. It thrusts aside the individual in favor of anonymous units that pile up into mass formations. Instead of the concrete individual, you have the names of organizations, and at the highest point, the abstract idea of the state as the principle of political reality. The moral responsibility of the individual is then inevitably replaced by the policy of the state. Instead of moral and mental differentiation of the individual, you have public welfare and the raising of the living standard. The goal and meaning of individual life, which is the only real life, no longer lie in the individual development, but in the policy of the state. The rulers, in their turn, are just as much social units as the ruled, and are distinguished only by the fact that they are specialized mouthpieces of state doctrine. They do not need to be personalities capable of judgment, but thoroughgoing specialists who are unusable outside their line of business." End quote. So we have it right here. This statistical way of viewing the world is, in Jung's view, responsible for helping to destroy our individuality, or destroy our self-knowledge. Even the rulers themselves are not individuals. They're not autonomous human beings capable of judgment. They're specialists. They fulfill a role, and they are rewarded for it. They follow a system of incentives and directives, just like we all do. The more successful manage to advance through the ranks, but they don't become individuals by that token. And Jung argues further in the passage, celebrities, powerful media figures, even the leaders of an ascended political party, those figures at the top are not truly individuals either. Their whole existence is borne up on the power of a collective. They are elevated to their position for the precise reason that they act as a voice for the collective. And so the situation is, quote, we are fascinated and overawed by statistical truths and large numbers and are daily appraised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality, end quote. And in light of that situation, we have no defense. We have no immune system against psychological infections. Quote, in this broad belt of unconsciousness, which is immune to conscious criticism and control, we stand defenseless, open to all kinds of influences and psychic infections. As with all dangers, we can guard against the risk of psychic infection only when we know what is attacking us and how and where and when the attack will come. Since self-knowledge is a matter of getting to know the individual facts, theories are of very little help. End quote. So this raises the question, why would mass-mindedness, as Jung calls it, take hold right now? Why is it definitive of the modern era and not some earlier time in human history? Jung's argument, that I anticipate will be the most controversial thing, at least in this comments section, is that religion is the counterbalance. Or rather, it was the counterbalance, until the statistical worldview overthrew it. Jung defines religion this way, quote, religion means dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of experience. These do not refer directly to social and physical conditions. They concern far more the individual's psychic attitude, end quote. So, what does it mean to submit to the irrational facts of one's experience that do not have to do with the physical, but with your psychic attitude? In other words, this means intuition, conscience, the way one feels in spite of the statistical reality or what have you. So for a real example, and I mean real insofar as I've heard people utter these words to argue for their religion, for many people, they will come to terms with the fact that the scientific understanding of the world tells their reason that it's impossible that there's a continuation of consciousness after the destruction of the brain. But the irrational fact of their psychic experience, as we might put it, how they feel, is that I just have to believe there's a world beyond this, that death isn't the end. Something deep within me tells me that, right? That's the kind of irrational experience Jung is describing. He also later uses the term metanoia, which means rebirth of the spirit, in discussing the potential with religious conversion for total personality change, which is an odd phenomenon. Those who commit themselves wholly to a religious conviction are sometimes capable of making sweeping life changes that are extremely difficult for most people. But we might say in the experience of metanoia, in a rebirth of the spirit, in a religious conversion, a genuine religious conversion, what is happening is somebody is submitting to an irrational fact of their own experience, their own psychical experience. And so it's certainly an interesting way of defining religion that Jung puts forward here. And furthermore, his argument for the function that religion fulfilled, the aspect of religion that allows it to serve as a counterbalance to that mass-mindedness, is a very creative argument, and I'm not sure I buy it personally, but it's an interesting dialectical maneuver that's worth considering. And that is, quote, it is possible to have an attitude to the external conditions of life only when there is a point of reference outside them, end quote. In other words, religion posits a world beyond, and by that token, we acquire the ability to make judgments about this world. I will do my best to give a strong defense of this position, which, normally I don't preface my defenses of, perspectives I don't agree with that way. But I mean, I would guess that many of you who have listened to the podcast for a long time would know that Going back to the first episode of the podcast, the thing that really enchants me about Nietzsche is the rejection of the other world and the world beyond. And so Jung directly opposes that. And he gives a rather interesting argument that is worth considering. So he says that religion speaks from the perspective of the other world as dictates of God or guidance of eternal Buddha, whatever the case may be. And so there is, in the religious worldview, a higher authority above the physical reality, and that provides, Jung says, a point of reference for making judgments within reality. Because we might say from a counterfactual, one might be forced to conclude that if reality is purely the physical world, only a material existence, no transcendent reality above it, one might be forced to conclude that all the goings-on within the world are, well, we might say innocent. This is the innocence of becoming. That's Nietzsche's view. It's Heraclitus's view. In other words, all things that happen are necessary. We might also consider Spinoza's perspective. While one might be able to make a judgment about what is good or what is bad from the perspective of a certain mode of existence, such as to speak of the good of the lion and the good of the gazelle, there's no absolute good that reigns over both of them. And so judgment from that perspective, true judgment, would seem to be rendered impossible. Now, granted, Nietzsche certainly thought it was possible. He says that every thou shalt was once an I will, and that as part of the revaluation of values, the individual could become a self-legislator of their own values. But even Nietzsche would admit that most people don't have that kind of wherewithal. They will likely have to submit to someone else's value judgments. Jung's argument is that the individual, within the religious worldview, is afforded the ability to exercise his own judgment and his own power of decision. Again, there's an obvious objection to that. That might be, well, under a religious dogma, the individual is actually discouraged from exercising his individual judgment. That's not so much what Jung is talking about, and he kind of has a counter for that we'll get into in a moment. What he means here is that in the religious worldview that teaches that every man has a soul, something eternal and of everlasting value, that all are equal in the eyes of God. All are subject to the laws of God. And so it puts every man on a kind of equal footing as a moral agent, such that a peasant could make a moral judgment about the behavior of a king. And he might politically submit to the king, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, but religion sort of gives him the right to judge. It posits that man is ultimately a free being, and that man is given a responsibility to make moral decisions, and thus, by that token, the right to make them. With rights come responsibilities, and conversely, with responsibilities have to come rights. The absolute moral standard and the absolute metaphysical reality of God, of the divine, it becomes that reference point around which every individual can orient themselves as the source of their own, admittedly, irrational judgments. But in this way, religion, as submission to those irrational facts of experience, is a grounding for the individual that resists massification. It resists the statistical overtaking the real. In absentia of that reference point, however, the statistical reality would be the overriding reality. It would be the highest reality in some sense. Individual judgment vanishes in the face of its power. It becomes absurd and impossible. Because what is your submission to your own irrational facts of your experience in the face of a statistical truth? And indeed, in the modern world, when you put up your anecdotal understanding or your lived experience against a statistical truth in an argument, you're likely to be laughed out of the room. Now, I mentioned earlier the objection that sort of sees religion as a source of dogma or doctrine. And Jung defines religion here in a way that separates it from that. It separates it from worldly instantiations of religion. He separates the religious experience from the religious institutions, and he uses the term religion versus creed. The religion is that which relinks you back to the divine, which is the ultimate authority over the world, the source of life, the moral guide, the various ways that religions see the divine. Whereas the creed is the compromise that the other world has to make with mundane reality in order for it to exist within it at all and to be effective within it. So the creed is the public institution whose members may not actually be religious, in other words. I mean, perhaps they are, perhaps most of them are, but the moment your religion becomes a public institution with an internal hierarchy and a bureaucracy and has to establish a payroll and has to collaborate with the state, or at least exist within some sort of relationship to the state, right? You have to strike that bargain with the mundane world. And so all of that sort of comes to define what the creed is, the institution. And perhaps the most forceful statement of Jung's argument that religion serves as this bulwark against becoming part of the mass is that he makes the assertion that being grounded in the divine, linked to the divine in some way, so in other words, real religion, not the creed, offers man the ability to go against the moral judgments of the masses. This is a huge theme in Nietzsche as well. We also see this in René Girard. What people think and the kinds of moral judgments they make, even the nature of their desires, this is powerfully shaped by the collective judgments that are expressed and impressed into the individual on a daily basis. And so therefore, in light of that, how could one endure against having their own individual judgment pressed and molded into the shape of the collective judgments? By what mean could the individual resist? On what basis would they resist? From the modern perspective, we tend to think of the religious mindset as conformist. That's the stereotype. But Jung would argue that conformity is found in adherence to the creed and becoming part of the public institution that demands a certain level of commitment to the doctrine and so on, but that religion is the sole mean of combating conformity, not the creed, the religion. It's a very, very important distinction. So Jung writes, quote, "Just as man, as a social being, cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real justification for his existence and his own spiritual and moral autonomy anywhere, except in an extra-mundane principle capable of relativizing the overpowering influence of external factors. The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. For this, he needs evidence of inner, transcendent experience, which alone can protect him from the otherwise inevitable submersion in the mass. Merely intellectual or even moral insight into the stultification and moral irresponsibility of the mass man is a negative recognition only, and amounts to not much more than a wavering on the road to the atomization of the individual. It lacks the driving force of religious conversion, since it is merely rational." End quote. There are historical examples of this, if there are modern types in the audience who are doubtful. The most powerful examples being martyrs, figures from history such as Joan of Arc, and many of the apostles such as John the Baptist. I mean, somebody from very recent history lived during Jung's time, during World War II. We might think of somebody such as Martin Niemöller. He was a Lutheran pastor who opposed the rise of Hitler, and he was imprisoned for it. And you've almost definitely probably heard his famous quotation, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not protest because I was not a socialist," and so on and so forth. That was him. That was Martin Niemöller. And he spent his years after the war regretting that he did not do more, admittedly. But he did quite a bit. I mean, he opposed the Nazis' Aryan paragraph. He opposed the Nazification of the churches broadly. He opposed the mounting political sentiment of the time that was overwhelming everything because of a personal religious conviction that the church cannot be allowed to be corrupted by a racialist political movement. And so we find throughout history that many of the figures that found the strength to oppose the overwhelming moral convictions of the masses leaned heavily on religious faith in order to find the strength to do that. But Jung goes on to make a striking claim here that religion is not based on faith. Rather, he says, faith is something that comes about as a result of the religious experience, the fact of having an inner experience or contact with the divine. The sense of faith, the sense of trust in God, is based on the experience, not the other way around. And I don't think you have to extrapolate this to mean a mystical experience on par with, say, Pascal's Night of Fire. More so that one develops a certain conviction out of, as Jung said earlier, irrational facts of their own experience that lead them to feeling, for example, there's a life after this one, there's a divine hand moving the forces of nature, so on and so forth. It's that grounding, that experience, that feeling that produces faith, and in Jung's view, produces morally autonomous beings capable of judgment. Religion in that way is an individualizing force. And by confusing religion with the creed, we only see the ways in which religion has to negotiate with the world, the ways in which it gets bogged down with the practical realities of operating in the mundane world, the practical realities of politics, bureaucracy, hierarchy, and so on. And that's because we've lost the religious experience. The modern person only perceives the various religions as creeds, as public institutions, because they don't believe there's any religious experience behind any of that, because they've never had one. And Jung says this is true of many of the believers as well. I mean, the many of the people who are members of a religion are in fact just members of a creed. And so to get back to what we were sort of searching for, the psychological immune system, the advantage of religious thought is that it takes account of the unconscious side of the psyche. It acknowledges the dark impulses in every person's heart, even if it speaks of them in metaphysical or spiritual terms, like speaking of the sinfulness of the flesh or selfish craving that the Buddhists say is like a poison, right? It nevertheless gives us that understanding. But that understanding, again, it has to come out of a genuine metanoia, a spiritual rebirth. That is the causa finalis of religion. If that does not happen, even the voice of your conscience will speak with the voice of the collective. Another point of Nietzsche's that this makes me think of, it's one that's on my mind because we were just going over the Gay Science Book 1 and sort of our first walkthrough. And one of the points that Nietzsche makes there is that it's not just the moral intuitions that have been inculcated into the individual over long generations that come from the collective in a sort of historical sense. He says that those moral intuitions that you have could even be overridden by the mass taking a different moral stance now, right? So you might say that it's always been a Christian tradition to give to the poor and be kind to those in need. And maybe that value was inculcated into Christians over countless generations. So we would expect that to be part of sort of the intuitive moral landscape of Christianity. But somebody like Nietzsche would say, and somebody like Jung would say, that you could have a zeitgeist in the present moment in which the collective turns very strongly against that idea. I'll just use a very vulgar, easy example, the idea of the prosperity gospel megachurches that might say, what you make, the money you make is yours, don't worry about giving it to the poor, right? Forget about that camel threaded through the eye of the needle passage, and then the gospel, forget about all of that, prosperity is good, and forget about charity to the poor or whatever, or maybe that, the church will take care of them, but you don't need to worry about that as a prosperous rich person. It's not your obligation, right? Nietzsche would say that the pressure of, if there's a critical mass of people who believes that in the current day, it will override all of the traditional inculcation of previous values. That the most powerful values of the collective are the ones that the collective consciousness or the collective emotionality is enforcing in the here and now, in right now. Okay, so what does the person of conscience do who truly believes in those, we might say the legitimate, tried and true Christian values, who finds himself in a society where the voice of the collective is completely going against that? Unless he has the genuine grounding in a religious conviction, if he just believes in the religion in the form of a creed, he will just go along with what the collective, the changes in the zeitgeist, if that makes sense. Jung writes in section 5, quote, "The religious person, so far as one can judge, is directly influenced by the reaction of the unconscious. As a rule, he calls this the operation of conscience, but since the same psychic background produces reactions other than moral ones, the believer is measuring his conscience by the traditional ethical standard and thus by a collective value, in which endeavor he is assiduously supported by his church. But the situation is radically altered when the worldly-minded man, who is oriented to external factors and has lost his religious beliefs, appears en masse, as is the case today. Here each of us must ask, have I any religious experience in immediate relation to God, and hence that certainty which will keep me, as an individual, from dissolving in the crowd?" End quote. As with many of the great critics of Nietzsche, In many ways, they still end up continuing the discussion along the terms that Nietzsche set, but with one of the factors slightly changed or inverted or something like that. Maybe that's a bit too abstract of an observation, but I'll put it this way. Jung is seeking the same end that Nietzsche sought after, insofar as Nietzsche's great task is to lead us out of the received judgments of the herd and into truly independent thought. And Nietzsche also questioned the dictates of conscience. He questioned that which we think to be intuitively true, just because it's reinforced by the church or by the collective. And Jung is thinking along the same lines, but Jung just sees religion in a fundamentally different way, because he would say true religion is the way out of the herdishness of the creed. Whereas Nietzsche, for one, he didn't even make a distinction between religion and creed. He wouldn't have seen that as a meaningful distinction, because he would have argued, for one, the other world posited by religion is not something that has to negotiate its existence with the mundane world. The very beliefs in an other world come from the mundane world. They come from us. They come from human psychology. He wouldn't have quite made that same distinction. But the point is, Nietzsche is trying to lead us out of religion and creeds to become individuals. Jung is trying to lead us out of creeds and into religion to become individuals. Same end. But Nietzsche's philosophy, it must be said, it's the exact kind of modern materialistic thinking that Jung would say necessarily leads us down the path to statistical thinking, even if Nietzsche would never intend that outcome. Because again, your conscious intentions are not nearly as important to Jung or to Nietzsche as we might calculate the importance of conscious intentions. Jung thinks the only way for religion to survive this onset of material thinking, and thus for the individual and his self-knowledge to survive this onset of materialist thinking, is if religion presents itself more symbolically. And he acknowledges that many Christians may have a problem with this. They may see a danger in treating the resurrection of Jesus as more symbolic than literal, because we might lose, for example, the hope of an eternal life. Jung points out somewhat cheekily, I think, people already believed in eternal life before the time of Christ, so we're not going to lose the hope for eternal life. The danger for Jung is in taking the story too literally and thinking about, say, the biology or the chemistry of how a dead body's cells rejuvenate themselves, and that, in light of that sort of consideration, you're going to throw out the entire story altogether if you analyze it on that level. And in absentia of any religious grounding, any bulwark against massification of the human mind, there's no capacity for individual judgment. There's no grounding against the waves of mass psychosis. And what happens is that the state becomes like a god. Again, another point that Nietzsche makes in the passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the New Idol. And as for why this is, it's because we naturally find ourselves overawed by the highest statistical reality, which is society. And thus, by that same token, the state, because the state is the worldly power that represents the abstraction of society. The state becomes the highest power that we submit ourselves to. And Jung would argue again, this is not a speculative statement, right? It's not merely a hypothesis. It's empirically demonstrated based on what we've seen in the dictatorships that arose in the 20th century and the communist bloc, which stands in opposition to the Western democracies, as Jung is writing these words in the year 1956. And even though the state possesses no capacity to give its adherents the kind of grounding that religion offers, they will still serve the state willingly. In fact, Jung says the lack of emotional grounding in the divine is compensated psychologically by fanaticism. Fanaticism is a kind of emotional excitement that's brought about by the energetic feeling of self-identification with the state and with its power. There is a metaphor throughout this essay about the macrocosm of the East and the West. And I say macrocosm here because the East, in some sense, stands for the unconscious and emotional impulse that pushes us toward tyranny, toward acquisition of power, the use of power, self-identification with power. And of course, the most powerful thing in the world is the state. There's nothing outside of the world, and thus nothing outside of the state, right? Whereas the West stands for that thin veneer of sanity and rationality, the rule of reason, as he calls it, constitutional government. The West governs according to those principles that have been established by religion, the dignity of man, all of these ideas that have allowed for relative freedom. But just as the conscious persona is a mere superficial gloss in the individual psyche that is not nearly as resilient and autonomous as we would like to believe, the West is also susceptible to falling into massification. So, Jung's point here is far from saying that the West is, we're the last best hope against communism because there's something special about the West. Rather, we have exactly as much capacity to transform into tyrannies as the East does. And meanwhile, Jung points out there seems to be resistance and we might say individuality that's mounting during this time in the Eastern Bloc. Jung mentions in a footnote, for example, the 1956 Polish and Hungarian crises. So in Hungary that year, student protests, they're violently suppressed by the government, which is subservient to Soviet Union. But in response, a popular uprising followed. Militias rose against the government. Their revolution only lasted like 12 days before Soviet tanks moved in and soundly defeated the rebellion. But so we might say it did not alter the power structure in the immediate future, but Jung is hopeful that similar such actions may disrupt and ultimately break the authoritarian power of the USSR. This proves that there is still some vitality and vigor within the East to oppose centralized authoritarian government. But conversely, the West, Jung argues that not only is the West not immune to massification, in the long term, he says, we might even be more susceptible. And this sort of ties in with the point I alluded to earlier, that the worldview of Nietzsche, which makes everything material, and thus everything within the realm of power, right? And power competition, so on and so forth, that sort of worldview will eventually lead to that sort of, what would we say, being overawed by the highest statistical reality. And so Jung writes, quote, "The West cherishes the same scientific and rationalistic Weltanschauung with its statistical leveling down tendency and materialistic aims as the state religion of the Eastern Bloc. What then has the West, with its political and denominational schisms, to offer to modern man in his need? Nothing, unfortunately, except a variety of paths all leading to one goal which is practically indistinguishable from the Marxist ideal. What happened not so long ago to a civilized European nation? We accuse the Germans of having forgotten it all again already, but the truth is that we don't know for certain whether something similar might not happen elsewhere. It would not be surprising if it did, and if another civilized nation succumbed to the infection of a uniform and one-sided idea. We permit ourselves the question, which countries have the biggest communist parties? America, which forms the real political backbone of Western Europe, seems to be immune because of the outspoken counterposition she has adopted. But in point of fact, she is perhaps even more vulnerable than Europe, since her educational system is the most influenced by the scientific Weltanschauung with its statistical truths, and her mixed population finds it difficult to strike roots in a soil that is practically without history. The historical and humanistic type of education, so sorely needed in such circumstances, leads, on the contrary, a Cinderella existence. Though Europe possesses this latter requirement, she uses it to her own undoing in the form of nationalistic egoisms and paralyzing skepticism. Common to both is the materialistic and collectivist goal, and both lack the very thing that expresses and grips the whole man, namely, an idea which puts the individual human being in the center as the measure of all things." End quote. So it's very interesting that he indirectly quotes Protagoras at the end there, the famous sophist teacher who is usually considered as a sort of founder of relativistic thinking, right? Which would seem to fall under that sort of paralyzing skepticism that Jung worries is taking over our historical and humanistic education in Europe. So remember, the U.S. education system was imported from Prussia, a school system that, in the Prussian context, was designed to create good soldiers in addition to educated citizens. And in America, we wish to use this to sort of set up our industrial economy. We figured that the same type of education for creating a disciplined, industrious young soldier would be good for creating a disciplined and industrious young worker. It's funny, again, it comes out of that same period of the 19th century, this faith in collective power, and experiments with new ideas about structuring society. And so the educational system of America is paradoxically fine-tuned to produce mass men. I say paradoxically because that would seem to be a contradiction in a society which once defined itself according to the frontier ideal of individualism and self-reliance and so on. And so no matter how anti-communist America might be in terms of its rhetoric at this time, and the average American at the time of writing this essay, I'm sure, probably truly believed in anti-communism. Nevertheless, it does not matter, because the real enemy is not communism. Communism was one historical expression, one manifestation of that mass impulse, but communism does not enclose the entirety of what massification means. We are dealing with a competition of religious faiths here, a faith in the state, in science, quote unquote, versus faith in religion. And it's not a matter of individual reason versus religion either, because appeals to idealism and reason also don't matter. These are, as Jung puts them, quote, bombination in the void, end quote. Because if the driving force is unconscious impulse, unconscious forces within the self, drives, passions, and so on, appeals to reason are somewhat pointless. The West ultimately leans on that same statistical faith that drives the communist ideal. Our arguments in favor of capitalism are just as much rooted in concepts such as public welfare, the consumer price index, gross domestic product, and so on. Mathematical abstractions that are very real, very powerful, but that's precisely the point. We devote ourselves to the power of those abstractions at the expense of individual meaning, human dignity, respect for the individual's moral judgment. All of that falls by the wayside under a statistical faith that becomes totalizing, and that is not simply under communism. That's a very small-minded way to look at things. And so Jung comes to a powerful conclusion, quote, resistance to the organized mass can be affected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself, end quote. But of course, the only route to that state of affairs is afforded by self-knowledge, which, as Jung argued earlier, is not knowledge of the conscious persona. And he says the medieval view held an advantage over us in this respect. They were much more helpful in their view of the psyche for actually understanding human psychology. The view of the self as a microcosm of society is how the medieval person saw the self. The self is a little community. This comes through in Nietzsche as well. The self as a multiplicity and a unity, a shepherd and a flock. But to reckon with the whole self, that whole multiplicity and unity, is to necessarily have to reckon with the unconsciousness. And so there's a very funny remark about Freud in this essay, actually, whom Jung knew personally. Freud was something of a mentor to Jung, and they eventually had a break over their differing views of the human psyche. But he says that the fear of confronting the unconscious is not only found among those who accepted Freud's theories, it was also found in Freud himself. Quote, who confessed to me that it was necessary to make a dogma of his sexual theory because this was the sole bulwark of reason against a possible, quote, eruption of the black flood of occultism. In these words, Freud was expressing his conviction that the unconscious still harbored many things that might lend themselves to occult interpretation, as is in fact the case. These archaic vestiges or archetypal forms grounded on the instincts and giving expression to them have a numinous quality that sometimes arouses fear. End quote. Jung doesn't really discuss the archetypes in this essay, but what Jung is referring to indirectly in this remark is that same hypothesis. Jung argues that ordinary human beings possess in their unconsciousness a number of subpersonalities, complexes which conform not to the details of the individual psyche, but to a series of types that are possessed universally. They are, as he says here, archaic vestiges, ancient aspects of the self which have developed for millions of years, and that therefore the conscious personality is a kind of mediation or like a negotiation of a confluence of impulses within the unconscious, which express themselves through these archetypes. And therefore, these archetypes appear in dreams, they appear in psychotic episodes, they appear in hallucinations, and so on and so forth. Wherever there's the break or interruption of conscious clarity, that's when we tend to encounter the archetype directly. And so knowledge of the unconsciousness could lead to an eruption of occult ideas, as we would, the encounter with all these subcomplexes and personalities, which seem to, as Jung writes elsewhere, have a sort of autonomy to them that is not appropriate, it would seem, for a psychological aspect of the personality. They seem to truly be their own personalities. The human being is a collection of spirits or something like that. That could lead to an eruption of occult ideas if widely accepted. And remember that occultism is very much in vogue when Freud and Jung were coming up. One of Jung's earliest publications was a psychological analysis of a young spirit medium. Seances, mediums, there was a vibrant subculture for this kind of thing in Europe at the time. And so Jung is therefore very clearly not in favor of occultism, for whatever that might mean. With the occult, just as with mythology, Jung is interested in the psychological reality. That doesn't mean he rules out the spiritual element. Jung is, I think, truly agnostic about, say, idealism versus materialism. His method is essentially to put the psychology front and center, leave the metaphysical implications aside, and remain open to those implications, but don't start from them as a conclusion, as the dogmatic religious types do. The people who hold religious claims, as he says here in The Undiscovered Self, based on unreflecting belief, which tends to vanish as soon as we think seriously about it. That is a large part of why religious belief is vanishing, because we refuse to think about it symbolically. We refuse to remain open to these questions and not be so, rigorous and analytical and mechanistic. Being allowed to let these sort of aspects of the human experience, which are irrational, sit with us and not have to, let them be numinous and mysterious and not entirely enclosed within our statistical scientific worldview. You've probably heard this very objection brought up in relation to Jung, that his work dabbles in pseudoscience or superstition, that his ideas are an attempt to, drag us backward in some way. And I sincerely think that is not what Jung is doing if we take him seriously. He's clearly an advocate for religious belief here, but I think those objections to Jung are themselves an expression of that same fear that he says that Freud had. The people who accuse Jung of being pseudoscientific and think, oh, we shouldn't listen to him, they are putting forward that same view, we must fit the unconsciousness with its numinous qualities into this enclosed perspective of a materialist framework. And if we don't do this, mysticism will come flooding back into our conscious belief systems. And won't that undo all of the work over these past centuries in which we've attempted to develop a rigorous system of scientific thinking that excludes all these unfalsifiable elements, such as religion? I don't think that's what Jung is doing, and I think that fear is just as irrational as the one that Freud put forward, because I think Jung is correct that by banishing these numinous or mysterious aspects of the human psychology out of the realm of polite discussion, out of the Overton window of what we can discuss, they do not go away. They simply remain unconscious, and they end up projected or transferred in all sorts of mischievous ways. And I won't go any further to that because it would take us too far afield. But I think that was an important preamble, because there's a sense in which Jung is trying to unify religion and science in his worldview here. We could maybe compare it, or say it has a similar sense to the way in which Nietzsche tried to unify art and science. Jung sees this as one of our great problems. These two essential aspects of the psyche are pulling in opposite directions. One has a choice between essentially disregarding all of the scientific findings of the past 500 years, or disregarding the very traditions that provided the opportunity for that flourishing of reason. Jung argues that from the Christian interpretation of the Logos, we receive the notion of the supremacy of the Word. That is sort of the foundation upon which all these scientific revolutions are even allowed to happen. And yet, they seem set in this irreconcilable opposition. It's like an unstoppable force hitting an unmovable object, because we can't have done with either one of them. We cannot set aside clear-headed, logical thinking, and we cannot set aside human meaning and human dignity without paying for either one of those decisions with very severe consequences. And, as a corollary to that Christian interpretation of the Logos, from which we receive the notion of the supremacy of the Word, which is necessary for man's mental development, as Jung argues, that Christian Logos itself has a shadow side, insofar as we have invested reality into words, which leads directly into reifying concepts, such as society or the state. And the very fact that this reifying tendency is running amok is perhaps the action of our religious shadow as compensation for our open irreligiosity. And, at least insofar as Jung is describing words here and how they have that immense utility for helping us to get hold of reality in some sense, think conceptually and categorically, which has this immense utility, it also unleashes the power of the imagination and idealism in a dangerous way. I mean, who else made that point? Well, last week, Mishima and Sun and Steel. A very interesting intersection between Mishima and Jung, who couldn't be more different with how they see the world in many respects, but there are those intersections there. So the fact remains that in the modern world, we now experience faith and knowledge as mutually exclusive, and Jung argues, quote, "The rupture between faith and knowledge is a symptom of the split consciousness, which is so characteristic of the mental disorder of our day," end quote. Jung's project in response to this is not best described as pseudoscientific. It is rather, in the very traditional classical sense, Jung is thinking philosophically. He's not arguing for adulterating science with religion, but putting them into a proper relationship with one another as accords a more fundamental philosophical position that attempts to account for and sort of set both into their proper place. His philosophical basis for this must be understood as part of Jung's argument concerning the primacy of consciousness. Jung writes, quote, "Without consciousness, there would be, practically speaking, no world, for the world exists for us only insofar as it is consciously reflected by a psyche. Consciousness is a precondition of being," end quote. Now, I'm, of course, in agreement with Jung on the first sentence. We only know the world through consciousness. The world for us is a world premised on the existence of consciousness. I think he goes a little far on the second sentence, that consciousness is a precondition of being itself. It's a much stronger claim. Wherever one comes down in these questions, Jung's incorporation of the metaphysical and his openness to the possibilities of religion is based on that philosophical approach, fundamentally. It's not an attempt to mix scientific empiricism with superstition. Science, in fact, from Jung's point of view, must remain empirical. But we have to philosophically ground our understanding of scientific truth by remembering that it provides us with truths that obtain only in the phenomenal world. And as far as Jung is concerned, the possibility of the superordinate world beyond the phenomenal, it's not only possible, but the belief in such a thing seems to have an empirically demonstrated effect of aiding the psychic health of people who believe in it. And furthermore, I think he's able to establish that superordinate world with his perspective on the primacy of consciousness as we laid it out. Jung explains his position very well in section 4, quote, "In the same way that our picture of the world had to be freed by Copernicus from the prejudice of egocentricity, the most strenuous of efforts of a well-nigh revolutionary nature were needed to free psychology, first from the spell of mythological ideas, and then from the prejudice that the psyche is, on the one hand, a mere epiphenomenon of a biochemical process in the brain, and on the other hand, a purely personal matter. The connection with the brain does not in itself prove that the psyche is an epiphenomenon, a secondary function causally dependent on biochemical processes and the physical substrate. The structure and physiology of the brain furnish no explanation of the psychic process. The psyche has a peculiar nature which cannot be reduced to anything else." End quote. The conclusions that Jung draws while thinking along these lines, and this attempt to give science and religion their due, is that the symbolic message of the life of Christ had the effect of creating individuality. Through this mythological story, Christians are led on this journey of self-knowledge that results in a grounded mindset in which the individual is given the responsibility, and thus the right, of moral judgment. By treating this as a purely historical and literal event, the Church becomes vulnerable to the demystifying effects of scientific materialism. And that approach to life, the scientific approach, takes no account of the psychological effect that accompanies metanoia, the true spiritual rebirth into the commitment to follow the example of Christ. Why would science avoid this? Well, because science has avoided psychology. Maybe not on the academic level, but on the individual level, the clinical level, the level of self-knowledge. Why? Well, because of everything we've discussed. The level of analysis is individual, irregular, defies statistical reality, and furthermore, because people with the scientific mindset suspect, like Freud did, that if the unconscious was deeply probed, that could result in a flood breaking forth of occultism and superstition. And so we have this situation in the current zeitgeist where we have knowledge in the statistical sense, but lack understanding. We value knowledge, but do not value understanding. Jung defines these terms roughly by saying, knowledge is what science seeks, knowledge is found only in those universal and statistical realities, understanding, on the other hand, is always individual. The only thing that can help us in averting this crisis that Jung sees coming, an inevitable slide into state worship, outbreaks of mass psychosis, embrace of tyranny, mass violence, so on and so forth. The only thing that can avert these possibilities is understanding on the level of self-knowledge. But so long as we remain resistant to understanding, we remain resistant to confronting the irrational facts of our own experience, to confronting the archaic vestiges within the unconscious, this is all to say, we avoid confronting what it is that really drives human beings. Well, so long as we avoid that, we will lack self-knowledge. And so the self remains undiscovered. And as such, we remain vulnerable to outbreaks of mass insanity. Perhaps my favorite paragraph of the Undiscovered Self is this one, in which Jung lays out this total picture as he sees it. Quote, "Unless the patient stands firmly on his own feet, the so-called objective values profit him nothing, since they then only serve as a substitute for character and so help to suppress his individuality. Naturally, society has an indisputable right to protect itself against errant subjectivisms, but insofar as society is itself composed of de-individualized human beings, it is completely at the mercy of ruthless individualists. Let it band together into groups and organizations as much as it likes. It is just this banding together and the resultant extinction of the individual personality that makes it succumb so readily to a dictator. A million zeros joined together do not, unfortunately, add up to one. Ultimately, everything depends on the quality of the individual, but our fatally short-sighted age thinks only in terms of large numbers and mass organizations, though one would think that the world had seen more than enough of what a well-disciplined mob can do in the hands of a single madman. Unfortunately, this realization does not seem to have penetrated very far, and our blindness is extremely dangerous. People go on blithely organizing and believing in the sovereign remedy of mass action without the least consciousness of the fact that the most powerful organizations can be maintained only by the greatest ruthlessness of their leaders and the cheapest of slogans." End quote. So at this point, one may ask what Jung's solution is. But therein lies the problem. I mean, I suppose you could say Jung has said the solution is self-knowledge, and the solution to finding self-knowledge is the religious experience. But, okay, how do we lead everyone to have a religious experience, right? The very problem is that we think the solution is found in some sort of universally applicable theory, as if Jung could conclude the essay by saying, well, here are the foolproof instructions, step 1, step 2, step 3 for achieving metanoia, right? And in some of the latter sections of the essay, he revisits another thread that sort of runs throughout the text that I haven't really mentioned much, but there are numerous remarks where he speaks of the undue trust that we place in words such as ought and should. We think that by making moral prescriptions, we can somehow change behavior. You could see this type of thinking as archetypally Kantian, the attempt to logically demonstrate the way of behaving correctly, based on empirical knowledge of what benefits or harms mankind. The problem with this is that it still addresses itself to the conscious persona, still is operating on that level of individual reason. And so already that approach fails to penetrate to the depths. Individual reason will be swept away. It will be crushed into atoms by the collective judgments and desires and drives of the mass. The eternal problem is that drives are pre-rational. The only recourse must be, therefore, to a similarly irrational bulwark. Part of religion's problem in the modern world is that it has continued to demand faith as a kind of moral prescription in order to shore up its position, being that most of its adherents are simply members of a creed following an unreflecting belief. And when one of the flock has doubts, when they notice the ways in which centuries of scientific knowledge have challenged a literal understanding of Christian dogma, they're told by their priest or whoever it might be to have more faith. They're given a moral prescription. You should have more faith, my son. And that is completely ineffectual. Jung writes, quote, "There is no sense in formulating the task that our age has forced upon us as a moral demand. We can at best merely make the psychological world situation so clear that it can be seen even by the myopic, and give utterance to words and ideas which even the hard of hearing will hear. We may hope for men of understanding and men of goodwill, and must therefore not grow weary of reiterating those thoughts and insights which are needed. Finally, even the truth can spread, and not only the popular lie." End quote. So the solution for Jung, as far as it even exists, is to make ourselves aware of the situation. Remember, as he argued previously, we can only defend against a threat if we know what it is, from where it approaches, how to defend ourselves. The beginning for Jung is the simple acknowledgement that we are not the consciousness, the acceptance that we are predominantly unconscious, and that this unconsciousness does not yield to reason. It is ancient. It is ruled by impulse. It's subject to the power and the force of the collective. If we were, just as a start, to integrate this knowledge into our daily lives, that would be a tremendous first step in the direction of self-knowledge. And that would come with the admission that we're not innocent, that we can't afford to believe that the kind of people who would form a tyrannical, genocidal regime are the ones who live in other countries. We would never do such a thing, right? That kind of naivete compounds the danger. It's the first thing that a true self-knowledge has to overcome. And part of that naivete comes from past religious dogma. Jung does not spare the church, his criticism. And here he makes a critique that, again, might reveal some influence from Nietzsche. Quote, "The crux of the matter is man's own dualism, to which he knows no answer. This abyss has suddenly yawned open before him with the latest events in world history, after mankind had lived for many centuries in the comfortable belief that a unitary God had created man in his own image as a little unity." End quote. As Nietzsche would have put it, the soul superstition leads directly into the ego superstition, the belief in the unity of the self. But the self is a microcosm, a multitude of forces. Increasingly, we're a microcosm of a whole international global order, a world that's quickly becoming interconnected and integrated on a global scale. And so Jung continues in the same passage by returning to the great danger should we continue in our naive outlook. Quote, "Even today, people are largely unconscious of the fact that every individual is a cell in the structure of various international organisms and is therefore causally implicated in their conflicts. He knows that as an individual being, he is more or less meaningless and feels himself the victim of uncontrollable forces. But on the other hand, he harbors within himself a dangerous shadow and adversary who is involved as an invisible helper in the dark machinations of the political monster. It is in the nature of political bodies always to see the evil in the opposite group, just as the individual has an ineradicable tendency to get rid of everything he does not know and does not want to know about himself by foisting it off on somebody else. End quote. Europe saw it in the world wars. There's no reason why it can't happen again, especially if Jung is correct as to why those wars happened, because nothing has changed fundamentally about the human psyche. If anything, we're in a worse situation than ever, as the statistical view of reality grinds on and becomes ever more totalizing. Democracies also have their flaws, as Jung writes. Quote, "There can be no doubt that in the democracies, too, the distance between man and man is much greater than is conducive to public welfare, let alone beneficial to our psychic needs." End quote. So it's not as simple as individualism versus collectivism. When Jung is talking about mass-mindedness here, once again, it's not just that we believe in this collectivist ideology of communism, because again, that's something that's on the level of the consciousness. It's, if anything, might be more dangerous when we're a bunch of atomized individuals who have no relation to one another. Because in reality, society does have an order, it does have an underlying logic, and the way in which all of those atomized individuals are related to one another is under the power of the state, right? That's the real logic of their relation. And so, in a way, the lack of community, the lack of any kind of collective identity can be even more dangerous. The massification, the mass-mindedness happens on that emotional, unconscious level. It's not on the level of your outwardly expressed ideology. But he goes on to say, all of our attempts to fix this by building communities are futile. Out of the same principle that we articulated earlier, a string of zeros never equals a one, no matter how many zeros you add together. We can keep trying to organize, we can keep trying to rally around some idealistic goal, but it will always be bombination in the void. And it's not an idle concern for Jung. He goes on to argue, quote, "The question of human relationship and of the inner cohesion of our society is an urgent one in view of the atomization of the pent-up mass man, whose personal relationships are undermined by general mistrust. Wherever justice is uncertain and police spying and terror are at work, human beings fall into isolation, which of course is the aim and purpose of the dictator state, since it is based on the greatest possible accumulation of depotentiated social units. To counter this danger, the free society needs a bond of an effective nature, a principle of a kind like caritas, the Christian love of your neighbor." End quote. Jung immediately follows this observation up with a reminder that this can't be taken as a moral prescription. That would be another appeal to idealism that would be ineffectual. You cannot make people love and respect their neighbors by telling them that they should. Instead, Jung says, this meditation here, this whole essay, it's intended only, quote, "to promote a consciousness of the psychological situation," end quote. And so in many ways, it's a rather uncertain note that the essay ends on. But in the brief final section, he says there are reasons for hope. For one, the shadow is not purely of a negative nature. It sometimes provides compensation for the one-sided perspective of the consciousness in a way that is beneficial. One example he gives, which might be surprising to some, as Jung is often, characterized as a sort of traditionalist. One example he gives is that modern art is a kind of compensatory movement of the psyche in the aesthetic realm, which is a way of coming to terms with the disruption of previous attitudes and orthodoxies. Quote, "The pleasingness of the artistic product is replaced by chill abstractions of the most subjective nature, which brusquely slam the door on the naive and romantic delight in the senses and on the obligatory love for the object. This tells us in plain and universal language that the prophetic spirit of art has turned away from the old object relationship towards the, for the first time, dark chaos of subjectivisms, Certainly art, so far as we can judge of it, has not yet discovered in this darkness what it is that could hold all men together and give expression to their psychic wholeness." End quote. So, artists are, by their very nature, often naive about making art, and often unself-reflective in some very stunning ways, which you will know if you've ever been around artists. So perhaps they haven't quite grasped, the world historical, psychological significance of modern art, but nevertheless, in the shadow that comes out in artistic expression, we have the potential for a new dawning awareness into our consciousness of the split nature of the modern mind, of the desacralized world that now confronts us. And so whatever might be said about Jung, whatever criticisms we might have, he's not a man who wished to look away from the darkness. We might say that gazing into the abyss seems to have been one of his main pastimes in life. And he felt this artistic confrontation is maybe a key step in the journey of self-knowledge. Perhaps in the artistic world, we're seeing a glimmer of what might come. Because again, the first step is to accept, to bring into our knowledge, into our consciousness, what the actual situation is, the chaos of inner subjectivism. And that's a basis for one potential hope for the future from Jung's view, a potential counterfactual to the inevitable slide into irrational tyranny. But Jung writes in the concluding section of the Undiscovered Self, quote, "We are living in what the Greeks called the right moment, for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. This peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not of our conscious choosing, is the expression of the unconscious man within us, who is changing. Coming generations will have to take account of this momentous transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself with the might of its own technology and science." End quote. These are beautiful words. They're very much to my liking. It's the kind of... I like when Jung speaks in these terms, but Jung invokes a grand narrative here toward the end of the text, using the language of generations and of the zeitgeist, of the collective reality proceeding towards a great collective transformation. And so accordingly, Jung can't leave off on that note, right? Jung has to remind us again, lest we lose sight of it, that the only hope for this transformation to be possible is in the individual. What is needful is self-knowledge, and that can only be obtained by the individual. And so we have to recenter ourselves as a kind of irrational demand. However we do it, through religion or philosophy, we need that bulwark. Jung finishes the essay as follows, quote, "Happiness and contentment, equability of mind, and meaningfulness of life, these can be experienced only by the individual and not by the state, which, on the one hand, is nothing but a convention agreed to by independent individuals, and on the other, continually threatens to paralyze and suppress the individual. The social and political circumstances of the time are certainly of considerable significance, but their importance for the weal or woe of the individual has been boundlessly overestimated, insofar as they are taken for the sole deciding factors. In this respect, all our social goals commit the error of overlooking the psychology of the person for whom they are intended, and, very often, of promoting only his illusions. I am neither spurred on by excessive optimism nor in love with high ideals, but am merely concerned with the fate of the individual human being, that infinitesimal unit on whom a world depends, and in whom, if we read the meaning of the Christian message aright, even God seeks his goal." End quote. That is, after all, the great redeeming quality of Christianity, even from the Nietzschean perspective. It is a worldview concerned with mankind, concerned with justifying, redeeming, and elevating mankind. The story of Christianity is the story of the redemption of man, and this is achieved by God embodying the individual human life. Jung's plea here at the end comes down to this: not to forget the individual human life, not to let the value of the individual human life fall by the wayside in lieu of the statistical average. In Jung's view, we have seen that this is the road to hell. Perhaps by the sheer fact of raising that brute reality into our awareness, we'll be able to defend ourselves against it. That's all for this week, everyone. Hope you enjoyed our return to the world of Carl Jung. And as a teaser, we may be coming back to Jung at the very end of the season as well. I have something very fun planned that I've mentioned before, a book that I've wanted to talk about by Jung for a long time. It just wasn't quite right to talk about it yet, and I wanted to talk about this essay because it's been very influential on the zeitgeist, on the current conversation, and on myself as well. So I hope everyone enjoyed. Please join me next time. It's going to be the 100th regular episode of the Nietzsche podcast. I have something very exciting planned for that as well. But what a milestone. So please join me for the 100th episode next week. Thank you, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.